Okay, how's everybody doing? Exactly. Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, fantastic film, right? Agreed? Fantastic. Okay, so we're going to talk about it now, all right? So we're going to invite on stage Hubert Davis, director. If you can just take a seat there, Hubert. All right. And then Janelle Joseph, take a seat. All right. And Simon Darnell. Okay, are we good? All right, awesome. Okay, great. So we're gonna have a lively, illuminating, timely, topical discussion about some very the film's issues oriented. Right, it's a pretty heavy film. When I saw the film, when I connected with Hubert in a publicity from a publicity standpoint. We saw the film, at TIFF. It world premiered at TIFF in September, and despite having seen the screener, having seen it in advance before it hit the big screen, it was a tearjerker. Did anybody, by a show of hands, any tears? Any tears? Okay, right. Okay, that's what happened with me, and I worked as a publicist on the film, and still, right, tearjerker. All right, so. Okay, so we're going to start with Hubert, and then, very curious as to what Janelle and Simon took away from this, get some input and insight. So Hubert, what's interesting with you is you have an interesting and noteworthy family background when it comes to sports, in that your late father played basketball, and he actually played for the Harlem Globetrotters, his father, for 18 years. Okay? His father, 18 years for the Harlem Globetrotters. Hubert also played university basketball at McGill University in Montreal. Okay? So when we talk about your films, you had also directed a film, Giants of Africa, which chronicles the Toronto Raptors GM Masai Ujiri's journey developing the basketball scene in Africa. So there's lots of basketball going on here, right? Harlem Globetrotters, you played college ball, films about basketball. What was it like venturing into the world of ice hockey?
Yeah, it's interesting because when the project first came to me, I was like, well, I didn't grow up playing hockey. I don't have a connection to it in the same way as I do basketball. But I thought what was interesting about it is, when we're talking about hockey, we're really talking about our own connection, right? As Canadians in this country, there's this. It's like an integral part of our identity is so tied into hockey. So I thought if we can talk about some of the issues that are going on in hockey, then we have a chance to talk about some of the issues that are going on in the country and put those two things together. And there was something else that was really interesting in hockey from the interviews that I had heard with different players even before we started filming. They talked about their love for hockey was so deep. And I think, I hope you get that out of the film, but they're all talking about it's not like anything else they played. They played multiple sports, they did all these things, but hockey was just different. It was just a different experience. And so their love was so tied to it that they would kind of do anything to keep playing and be in that community. And so I thought that was interesting, the idea of loving something that doesn't always love you back. And so, yeah, that's how it ended up.
Okay, great. Janelle and Simon, I'm interested, we were hanging out in the reception area, and you having not seen the film before. And I want to get, before we really dig into it, I want to get your sort of knee-jerk response to the film, because there's a lot, yeah. We'll start with Simon, and I'll jump over to Janelle.
If you'll forgive me, I'm going to go straight to the academic analysis of this film, because I come to this mostly as a sports sociologist, and the students that I work with, some of them are here, will probably roll their eyes, that I'm always encouraging us to think of sports as not just a reflection of society, but actually one of the places where we build our social structures and social relationships, and that really came through in this film. I think this is a really potent example of the fact that hockey is one of the ways in which Canada gets built. And it's in that building of Canada through the cultural phenomenon of hockey that some people get included and some people get excluded. And I think one of the things that the film also really helps us to do is to remind us that those narratives that we're offered are not nearly as stable or straightforward or insular as we're often led to believe. The stories of blackness in hockey are really potent for challenging those narratives about who belongs in Canada and who doesn't. So, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Janelle?
Yeah, one of the things that I keep coming back to, not only as a sports scholar, but as a scholar of Black Canada, is this narrative of who is the Black Canadian, right? The absented presence, the visibility and hyper-visibility and also invisibility at the same time. And the connections, the international connections, you know, it's there in the film and it's not so explicit. Obviously there's Canada and the US and the National Hockey League. But when you, some of the research that I've done on the Colored Hockey League of the Maritimes, you know, those leaders who were leaders in the church and leaders in their community, they were international Pan-Africanists. They were leading the conversation across the globe in that post-slavery period of, you know, what does it mean to be Black? And they noted that that empowerment that comes through sport, that physical power, that joy, that freedom on the ice is key to Black power, capital B, capital P, right? That's key to understanding ourselves as human. Never mind, you know, the ways that they are being positioned as second-class citizens. So that, I think, really powerfully comes across in the film, the need for Black Canadians to be seen as key to the culture, as part of the community, and the ways that we have been continually, repeatedly pushed aside and excluded. I don't know about you, you mentioned tearjerkers, but I don't know about some of you, you know, some of those words were hard to hear, right? We're all sitting with that pain now, every single one of us. And Matt Dumba, he really mentions the ways that his own family background is mixed race and nobody knows what he is or who he is. And so he feels a need to speak up for everyone. And we should all be feeling that, right? We all need to be living that solidarity because that's what it's going to take for these narratives to change.
Right, totally. Okay, and I have I don't know if the mics are quite working. Yeah, I don't think. They're okay? Okay, good. So I played hockey. Are there any parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents that have kids that play hockey by show of hands? Okay, great. And are there any, because I see some young people out here, are there any kids out here that play hockey? Okay, great. Awesome. Okay. So keep playing hockey. I played hockey for many years, and it's a sport that I guess I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with, right? Is that it's just a fantastic sport. But clearly, the sport, there's some issues. There's some issues that Hubert did a great job of, sort of outlining in 97 minutes. Now, the National Hockey League, the NHL, it remains the only visible North American professional sports league that has such tiny numbers of Black participants. Okay, so if you look at something like football, American football and soccer football, European football, Latin American football, Latinx. Basketball, and it goes on and on. Now hockey is Canada's, national sport, and while we as Canadians continue to tout this image of diversity and multiculturalism, our national pastime, which is hockey, it has obviously betrayed this notion, right? If you look at what's happening with on ice, coaches, managers, it's not a reflection of what's really going on in Canada. So the question I wanted to ask the three of you is, when it comes to sports at both the amateur and pro level, it feels to me that ice hockey, it seems like light years behind other pro sports, okay, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, okay? You don't need to be an academic or a journalist or publicist to see that. So what in your opinion, what in your respective opinion is it about the sport itself, do you think, that makes it so resistant to change? Why is change so slow, in hockey in particular?
Money. Money. Okay. One of the people that you interviewed mentioned how all you need is a stick and a pair of skates, and everyone in the community was out there, out on the ice playing, and that's not happening today, right? In terms of elite, regular house league, never mind, select rep elite hockey. So I think that's part of the issue, is that the intersection of class and race and the exclusionary cultures of hockey is definitely part of that problem.
I would totally agree with that. I also think that change in hockey is going to require an actual anti-racist approach, and I don't see much of that commitment in the sport of hockey. There's a sense in hockey that we recognize that racism is a thing and we shouldn't do that anymore, but that's different than actually putting forward proactive policies and approaches that would try to break down racial barriers and racial stereotypes. And I think some of that is the emotional part of it. I mean, I think that part of the film was fascinating to me. Both the emotion of hockey, how much everybody in the film said they loved the game, and then also the emotional aspect of racism and how much emotional heavy lifting we're going to have to do to confront the history of racism in this country. And I think there's some potential there, but I think that's really uncomfortable for a lot of people to do, and most people that are going to hockey rinks aren't prepared to do that right now.
Right, totally.
Yeah, I would say that that through talking to you guys and Deborah on the film, that's what I learned is it's actually the systemic part of it is it's all these things. It's not trying to tackle it on an individual basis, and I think that's what's happening right now. I was talking to a father whose kids are in hockey in Brampton, and he was saying the problem is now they're trying to tackle it as just punishing the kid, trying to get the kid out for a certain amount of games, and how that's actually not having a great effect, because then the parents of that kid are trying to fight even harder to say, oh, no, nothing happened. So they start to really go to all these other, and it's what you're talking about is really as an organization, how are we going to change this? And as opposed to trying to, you said, eliminate the racists, we just got to get rid of the racist people and not realize that there's we have to look at the entire system and retrain and look at that in education, all those pieces. And without that, it's just going to continue to happen over and over again.
Right. And in the film, you sort of touch on, I'm pretty active on social media, and I just threw up a post a couple days ago to implore people to come out to check out the film, but to also speak to some of the ugliness in the sport. So hockey is a sport. When I say some parts of it, it feels like it's stuck in the Stone Ages. As me having played hockey, and for the young people, you should continue to play hockey. It's an amazing, amazing sport. Racist taunts are hurled at players routinely, right? It's almost a part of the culture. So if and don't rely on me to tell you this. If you just go on Google and Google N-word and hockey, and you're going to see how many results come up. It's unbelievable, right? In Canada, December there was a big case in Quebec. November, another case in Toronto. Every month, there's some, pretty much, right? And this is not hyperbole. Just Google N-word and ice hockey, and you're going to see how many stories pop up, right? So many black hockey players in the past, and maybe even now, they will admit to just putting their heads down to take the abuse, right? It's not like you want to go up in the stands and start brawls or anything like that, right? And they try to carry on because they have to, right? They want to play the sport they love, like I did. But what do you tell, young people here, parents, uncles, grandparents that have kids playing a sport where the N-word is hurled at players routinely? It's not even something from the 1800s, as is outlined in the film. It's happening all the time, 2022, 2023. What kind of messaging, as academics, as scholars, as a director? What do you tell people that? Yeah.
I mean, I think it goes back to the accountability piece. I think it wasn't, I don't think the players, when I interviewed them, were, they obviously were hurt by the incident happening and they internalized that, and that's one part of it. It was more the accountability for everyone else who was involved, parents, coaches, everyone, that they didn't kind of take it seriously. That seemed to be kind of the mode that they were in, is well, I'm accountable. I'm accountable for my actions on the ice and the things we do, and it's such a team game that you have to be accountable. But it just didn't feel like there were other allies in those spaces. And even with Mark Connors, I think the interesting thing is he's fighting it with his dad, and he's 16 years old. But a lot of people told him don't bother, don't bother. But they felt like they had to for younger people, and he's only 16. So yeah, the accountability piece, I think, is a big part of it.
And I wonder, if we know that it's happening all the time, then what are we doing proactively, right? When that coach is recruiting players, when that coach is having those initial orientations, when the players are together in the locker room and they know it's going to happen, what kind of conversations are they saying to each other? Who's got my back when that banana gets thrown? Are they having those conversations? That would be an anti-racist approach. That would be an approach that says, racism is happening here. What are we going to do about it? And so if we rely on that reactive approach, then we're only going to be trying to punish the racists, and we're not going to get very far. So, many of the people you interviewed said, we didn't know what to do. Or I was only 10, I was only 13, I was 20, I didn't know what to do. I looked around, nobody knew what to do. Right. So we need to be having that conversation, I think. If we want to make that change, we need to be talking about what we're going to do when it happens, because we know it will.
I think another part that's worth adding here is that what goes along with the anti-black racism in hockey is the normativity of whiteness in hockey, and it's still, I think, entirely possible. In fact, I'm seeing it firsthand these days for kids to go through a hockey season and really only see other white kids, and so my son plays hockey at North Toronto, not far from here, and we played Seaside about 6 weeks ago, I think. They came to our rink, North Toronto Arena at Yonge and Eglinton, and it felt different that night. It felt different when a team made up mostly of black kids and their parents came to North Toronto Arena to play us. I don't know, we didn't really talk about it. It was all of that awkward silence that is in the film. And I think that's still feeding into the culture of hockey as white. And then when the game was over, we just didn't talk about it. So I've been thinking about ways that we might talk about that on our team, but I think that's the other side of this coin that sustains the racism in hockey, is that it's possible to not talk about it if you don't want to, if you're privileged enough to not want to.
Yeah, that's interesting, that you can have the option just not to talk about it if you want.
And if you're white, yeah.
Right, totally, yeah. I mean, as far as statistics, the NHL, for the first time, they did an internal demographic study last year, and they found that, as far as hard data statistics, 90% of players and nearly all coaches and officials are white, 90%, okay, 90%. And then the 10 would be racialized, indigenous, everyone else, okay? So even over to Hubert, I mean, when we talk about, because here's the thing too, one of the issues, so I was born in Toronto, born and bred in Toronto, and I think in Toronto we spend an awful lot of time patting ourselves on the back for being all multicultural. But then what that does, I'm not from that school of thought, because what that does now is we're sort of sticking our head in the sand, or in the clouds, and not really looking at the hard issues that are happening, right? So when you're, so this idea of racism in sports, in hockey in particular, were the hockey players that you interviewed, and you've interviewed, from pro to amateur levels, Hockey Diversity Alliance, were they really hesitant at first to even talk about racism in hockey? Because in hockey, in some sources, there's this code of silence. People don't want to talk about the hard issues, about things tied to gender, race. People don't want to talk about it. So did you have any,
Yeah, there's definitely that. Some players didn't talk to us in the documentary, or didn't want to come forward, and sometimes it was painful. It was too painful. It was something that they didn't want to relive, which I totally understood. There were other players that we approached, high-profile players, white players that we thought might be allies to come and talk about it, but sometimes they didn't feel, or their agent didn't, maybe we never got to them, was probably the case. So yeah, it was, I think there's also the economics of speaking out, right? Like some people talked about, like for the Hockey Diversity Alliance, they talked about how they started with like 30 guys and they end up going down to, I think it's like 6 or 8. And they were saying that a lot of guys would say, hey, I'd love to, but I'm like up for a contract. Or let's say, you're in a position, you're at an NHL team and you're going up for a GM position. So there's the economics of that, of speaking up and speaking out, that is real. And so again, I can't blame them for that either, because they're saying, look, this is what I got to do. This is my livelihood. And so as a documentary filmmaker, I can come in and talk to people, but there's life after the film for them. So I think the economics part of it, and that fear of speaking up and what that actually means, is obviously real.
Right, totally,
yeah. I think Akim Aliu is a fascinating case study in not just anti-racist work, but political activism in sport. And I have a research interest in this. I've talked to athletes over the last few years that identify as political activists, and they all talk about the backlash. They all talk about the pressure to conform, to not speak out. I think that's a near universal experience of athletes that speak up on social issues. But I also take the point, which I think is correct from the film, that hockey culture being so strong and so team-oriented, which is part of the beauty of it, it really hammers down on athletes to not speak up on these issues. So I actually think, Alou's story is almost underplayed a little bit how significant it was for him to speak up on this issue, because hockey culture does not open that space very easily at all.
And another thing that's kind of invisibilized in that conversation is the intersectional identities, is the heteronormativity of hockey as well. I think Angela James is a perfect example of someone who was not given their flowers when they were due because of homophobia, because of racism, and because of sexism. And if we want to talk about race, we really need to be talking in these more complex or nuanced ways about people of many different religions and other kinds of backgrounds and the ways that racism affects them.
Right, totally. Even from a research perspective, the systemic racism issues, they've been going on for decades. They've been present in hockey for decades, and as you can see in the film, these conversations have been happening since the 1800s, quite literally. It's nothing new under the sun, and the findings and research around racism in hockey, as comparable to sexism, hockey, homophobia, it's nothing new really. So and even in the film Kirk Brooks, he says that the NHL has been talking about diversity issues since 1993. Right? It's 2023. It's like 30 years. So what I wanted to ask Janelle, Simon, what do we do with this research that it's to bring about meaningful, tangible change? Because we can do I don't even need, to be honest, reports and research. I played hockey, so I can tell you, okay, there are race issues. People get called all kinds of racial slurs, profanities. What do we do with this research? Because a lot of research just sits on bookshelves or hard drives and collects dust. Doesn't really go anywhere, and then we're going to be having the same conversation 20 years from now. So what do we do with this meaningful research? Yeah.
Well, in my research lab, what we're trying to do is connect directly with those power brokers, right? So whether it's athletic directors or the people who are administrators within sport, people who are writing the sport policy, when people say, I didn't know what to do, we could say, what does your policy say? And then when they say, we don't have a policy, then we can start there. We have a tangible place to start. So for me, it's about figuring out who are the people in power and what do they need in order to do their job so that we can mobilize the stories that we already know so that it can affect some kind of tangible change. So policy is one part of it, education is another. And many of us have heard these stories again and again, but some people haven't, or they haven't heard it in a way that it actually makes them feel as though this is their problem. That kind of normative whiteness that you're talking about. You can conveniently ignore the problem if it doesn't affect you, but it does affect you. It affects all of us. So helping people to see that it affects them, part of that is education. And when I say that, some people think, oh, you're going to send me to a workshop, an anti-racist workshop, and then it'll be fixed. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to work with digital storytelling and really trying to connect people to each other so that these conversations can happen in lived, real ways, because we know that we are all of our relations, we are all connected to each other. And so I think when these stories can be shared face to face or in digital ways, that those people who have the power to make the change will actually feel something and will do something different.
Our colleague Courtney Zito at Queen's University, who's actually a KPE grad as well, she and her research group have put forward a policy framework that hockey organizations can adopt. So, to Janelle's point, it's getting harder and harder, I think, for hockey organizations to say, we don't know what to do. There are frameworks they can take up if they want to. But the other thing that comes to mind for me is, if the question is why hasn't the NHL done more about this, there isn't much incentive for the NHL, really, I don't think, because what are they trying to do? They're trying to sell the game of hockey to audiences and make sure that they have enough players coming through the pipeline. My point is, I think we can start to resist the idea that NHL hockey is the only form of hockey, that's the only place where hockey culture exists, and that we can open up spaces, hopefully, for kids to play hockey, not because they want to make it as hockey players, but because this is a fun, healthy, inclusive physical activity that we all should have access to participate in. I just wonder about the culture of winning and how that, I think it takes precedent often over these other social issues, and if we can kind of undermine that culture of winning, then that gives us a chance to think about this as a more social activity and less about an activity of dominance.
Right, right. And we're also going to open up the floor. I hope you have some burning questions, like because we have some very special, esteemed guests here. I want three of you to respond to this scene in the film. Early on in the film, Team Canada silver medalist Saroya Tinker, she recounts her father's process whenever he enters hockey rinks, right? And he enters a hockey rink. The first thing he does is he looks at the pictures on the wall to see if he can find any black individuals, and that result will determine his actions moving forward, right? And if he does not see any black faces at the hockey rinks he attends with his daughter, then he knows he's going to have to go out of his way to make others feel comfortable. Okay, this is a part of his ritual, process, entering hockey rinks. When I watched that scene, it seemed emotionally grueling, right? I wanted you all to respond to that scene. First as a director, because that, for me, was something else. And Janelle and Simon. Sorry.
Yeah, I think we often don't talk about the internal part of how racism works. And I thought that his story, and also Saroya, when she talks about, it was the first time she realized that other people looked at her differently than she looked at herself. And I thought that was like such an interesting thing, because she's 10 years old or something around that age, so she had lived her life up to that point, kind of carefree, and this is great, and then it was like, oh, okay, this is different. And I just think it speaks to the experience, right, where I was trying to get that across, like that idea of what that experience is like. And then also that she kind of starts to doubt, like, does everyone look at me this way? Like she can't quite figure that out, and was grappling with it. And I think a lot of just talking about that particular scene, it was actually the editor who was working on the film who he was like, okay, we need this scene, and he's white, and he was just talking about he never thought about that experience. So when he brings his kids to events, he couldn't fathom that you would have to go through that mental gymnastics, and that's why it hit him so hard, which is why we put it in the film.
We have a lot of those kinds of spaces at the University of Toronto campus where we venerate our deans and former presidents, and there's an exaltation of whiteness, especially through photographs, when we are trying to capture the history of a place. And I think that's why Deborah Thompson's words are so powerful in terms of that visibility, making sure that everyone who is there is represented and is part of the storytelling and the story making of a place. So, even being in this room today, I'm so happy that all of you came out today, and we have an opportunity to share, and I have a chance to see myself reflected, and some of you youth have a chance to see what is possible. And it's through that visioning and storytelling and representation and representation that we can change our ideas of who is a hockey player, who is a leader, and then who can rise to those positions of power, so that when we're celebrating the organizers or those who have dedicated themselves or put their names forward for the arenas and these leagues, that all of us Canadians are represented.
It's a huge part of hockey culture, right? Of going to a rink, going someplace you haven't gone before, but when you get there, it's going to be a hockey rink. They all kind of smell the same, they all kind of feel the same, they all kind of look the same. But it's not an experience that I think most white people have to go through when they go into the rink and think, oh, do I belong here? Most, I think, white people connected to hockey walk into the rink and know that they're going to be safe, and that they're going to be that they belong there. So I think that's a really powerful reminder of how racism operates. That's a key distinction between racialized subjects in the world that we live in.
Right, totally. Yeah. No, it's grueling, draining. It's yeah, right. So as far as the film, so Akeem Aliyu and some other members, like there's something now called the Hockey Diversity Alliance, whose purpose it is to help eradicate racism and intolerance in ice hockey. And while it's a bit sad and depressing that it sort of took George Floyd, like this black male, to get choked out in real time and then now everybody's like, hey, racism is a thing, anti-black racism is real. I mean, that's quite depressing. Nevertheless, the formation of the Hockey Diversity Alliance was inspired by this George Floydian tragedy. What I want to ask you all is, after viewing this film, whether you have a strong or remote interest in ice hockey, doesn't matter the level, at the professional level, NHL, GTHL, do you genuinely feel that this is a new day? As far as us humans having a more sustained interest in activism in sports? Because Simon and Janelle, you do, in other sports as well. I've looked at some of your background. Is this a new day for you? Does this feel like a turning point, in human history when it comes to tackling racism in sports?
Well, I started my role as a critical race scholar of sport in the summer of 2019. And so I've been doing this work. And the fact is, the scholars that I draw from have been doing this work since the 1800s. And that's, are written in English that I can access documents. We know that this anti-colonial, anti-racist work has been going on for centuries. So, is this a new day? So I started by saying that I began my position in 2019, just to give some context to the work that I was doing, at least for that year. It changed dramatically in the summer of 2020. My phone did not stop ringing. And there were many different sports organizations that were activated, enlivened, ready. And so we got to work. And I'm really happy for that opportunity and for that energy. But other than George Floyd, many Black people here in Canada are dying daily. And so we can't wait for video trauma to ignite the work. So is it a new day? In some ways, yes. We didn't have sports boycotts before that summer in terms of, entire leagues taking a day off or a few days off of their sports. We didn't have celebrity athletes speaking up in the same way. But we have had athlete activists since the early 1900s drawing attention to human rights, not just anti-Black racism, but human rights. We can go through many different sports, many different decades. We've had those athletes. So yes and no. It's new in that we have energy around this issue now, but it's also old when I read James Baldwin and Audre Lorde and my ancestors. They were saying the same things. I think, was this written yesterday? No. So the connection with sport, I think, is not new. The anti-racist activism is not new, and yet here we all are today. So there's some new things.
On the one hand, I'm encouraged and inspired by I think there's real narratives of resilience in the film. People pressing on despite everything that's happened to them, and refusing to give up on the love of hockey. And I'm in all the way with that too. I mean, I genuinely love this sport, and I think there's real beauty in some great shots, by the way, of skating. Right, it's such an aesthetically beautiful sport, and also the teamwork and the team culture that it affords us. So I think there's real opportunities in hockey, and I refuse to give up on the idea of those opportunities, not just for anti-racism, but for inclusive masculinity, for combating homophobia, the class part of it. I'm not sure we're ready to confront yet in hockey, but we could think about that as well. But none of it's happening automatically, and it will not happen just if we kind of let it, hope that it will happen. It's going to take intention to think about what an anti-racist approach to hockey will look like.
Totally, yeah. And the film, it's highly educational. That's why I'm glad I see some, young boys, girls say that's the future. You know what I mean? I love to see this, and I'm hoping you're going to keep playing hockey. You're not going to quit. You're going to keep going, all right? Because it's just a fantastic sport. Now the thing is, the film it's based on the book Black Ice: The Lost History of Colored Hockey League of the Maritimes, 1895-1925. It's written by these two guys who you saw in the film, George and Daryl Frosty. And in the film, we all learned that in 1906, this hockey player by the name of Eddie Martin, he became the first player to use a technique known as a slap shot. All right, the slap shot. Do you want me to demonstrate? You know, for those who don't play hockey, it's the slap shot. All right, so Martin is a black guy, you know, from who played for this team called the Halifax Eureka in what was then known as the Colored Hockey League of the Maritimes, and so this guy goes largely unrecognized for this innovative method, right? Are there any hockey players, you know what a slap shot is? You've done a slap shot? Okay, hockey players? My hockey nation, right? We know what a slap shot is, right? So how does something like this go, like it's just, because even I was blown away, and I played hockey straight until high school. That, you know, black guy essentially invented the slap shot. Nobody knows about this, and other things too. How does this, Hubert, as a filmmaker, as a director? Like,
Yeah, well, I think that's part of what I realized about the Black experience. You know, I grew up in Canada, you know, but I didn't, like, I knew about Africville a little bit, you know. It wasn't really taught in my high school, but I kind of understood, but I assumed that it wasn't important because I wasn't taught about it. And I think that was a really crazy thing for me, is to understand the richness of Black history in Canada. Like, I didn't know that. I was actually quite embarrassed and kind of ashamed to be like, why didn't I know this? And then going through the process of making the documentary and talking to descendants and talking about, you know, all these different communities and learning about that, they were like, well, we never, even after the Colored Hockey League ended, we didn't stop playing. You know, like, it's always been part of our culture. And so I think what I realized is, when we look at history, we have to understand that the Black experience is often like in the margins of things. Like, if we look at the main picture, you have to sometimes find things in these other places, and there's a bit of detective work that has to go into that. But once we understand that, as far as history and narratives and stories that are told and that we hear, you realize how many other stories, like, that's just one example of it, but how many other stories are we not telling that need to be uncovered and found and brought to life.
And it excites me that hockey story is connected to economics. It's connected to the church and religion, specifically the Colored Hockey League of the Maritimes. It's connected to, you know, businesses in the area and the story of Africville, and all of those stories create the richness of our many Black communities. And, you know, that community in Nova Scotia is so long-standing, but there are pockets just like that all over Canada. Yeah. And so the stories, our sports stories, are our stories. They are our community stories, and they all deserve to be told. If we can do a better job of looking at the margins and then honing in on that, then we can actually recenter those stories, and the history won't get lost. I'm so pleased that you had an opportunity to speak with some people who were descendants who, you know, heard the stories from their grandparents, and that, you know, couple generations removed. And we need to do more of that before we lose that older generation's histories.
Yeah, and even Simon or Janelle, this idea around erasure, even outside of hockey, is this something as researchers you have to grapple with as far as your day-to-day, you know, like erasure, because that's what the subhead is, right? There are all these factoids people know nothing about, right? The stuff that I learned about, and I'm old. And I'm just like, what? A black guy invented the slap shot? I didn't know this. In your research and is this something you have to deal with a lot as far as erasure? Just digging, constant digging, you know, retelling, sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I'm not a historian. I think this is why we need historians. We need people to go back and retell the stories that we missed the first time around, you know, or the many times around. Because I'm a sociologist of the present, so I'm often looking at what are the stories that we're telling right now, and sometimes those are based on erasure, and it's, you know, underpinning the stories that we have right now are all the stories that we haven't told ourselves or that we haven't come to terms with. So yeah, absolutely.
Right. And what's your feeling? And we're going to open up the floor soon, right? I think, yeah, just because I want to get some questions, because we all want to know what you all thought about the film, and you might have some pointed questions towards director Hubert Davis or the Janelle. Simon, so while Toronto, you know, again, maybe I have a love-hate relationship with my city too. Like, I was born and bred here, love Toronto. Some parts of it I absolutely loathe, like the cost of living and other issues. But so while Toronto is the most multicultural city in the world, all right, and hockey is obviously, I guess, our national sport. Do you get the sense that a lot more, like, are you seeing a lot more parents from diverse communities? Do you think they're steering their kids more towards playing hockey over, say, in 2023 onwards? Hockey, football, soccer, basketball. What do you all suspect? What are you all seeing? Just based on how the perception and reality of the sport of ice hockey versus basketball or soccer or football. What do you suspect is happening?
I mean, I would say a lot of it is representation. So it's what you see, like what you see in that space. Like I think of, my own son plays basketball because I play basketball, so I teach him basketball, and then he looks to see, affirmation of people that, kind of look like me that are in the sport. So I think there's a lot of that just, exists. That it's part of it is the visual representation of things. Is just where we learn where we're comfortable or where we see ourselves. So I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, it's like, how do you engage, like after having watched this film, right? There are parents of hockey players, racialized black and racialized kids out there. There are kids here that are racialized. Like, the question is, how do you engage after having seen some of this, some of the ugliness and some of the beauty, but how do we engage black and racialized kids to want to play hockey and not something else, right? Anything?
I think the Seaside Club is an inspiration. I think Kirk Brooks' work is really important because I think hockey still, for a lot of white middle class families, represents a form of distinction. Right? It's a way to separate yourself in class terms, so that hardens these kinds of categories that we're talking about instead of disrupting them. So I think intentional organizations that have an anti-racist mandate or a diversity mandate or an inclusive mandate are really important in hockey, and I think still too few and far between.
Yeah, part of my message would be to look within in terms of reflecting on what is important to you and in the sport that you play. So for those who are getting a lot of joy and love out of hockey, then absolutely continue with that. For those parents who can afford it and want to keep their kids in hockey, then encourage them. I think in Toronto, we do see a diversity of participation across many different sports, but Toronto is not all of Canada, of course. So, having opportunities to be on teams where there are other racialized players, to be able to connect with folks, to be able to play the sport both at a school level and a community level, and perhaps a more competitive level, all of those are really important for youth, for all youth, but especially our racialized youth in Toronto. So it's finding those ways to unlock the doors that have previously been closed, and sometimes that's an infusion of resources and funding and grants, federal, provincial, community level funding, so that we can keep those doors open. But I think that the youth are playing all different kinds of sports, but they're getting affirmation or more affirmation and inclusion in some rather than others.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're going to open up the floor, and the first line of questioning from BVA. Member, BVA member, right there. Okay, and then, so when you have it, just put your hand up, and I'll make note back there. We'll just bounce around. Okay, so we're gonna start with the BVA members. They have a question or two over here, and then we're gonna attempt to pass the mic around from aisle to aisle. Okay, so are there other? How many mics do we have out there? Just the one, two? Okay, one on this side. Okay, great. Okay, so we'll start here. Question?
Yeah, so as a racialized athlete myself, I would just love to hear what advice would you give to other athletes who experience microaggression or discrimination in sport?
I would say look for your allies. So, if you are experiencing something, if you've noticed it, then maybe there's someone else who has noticed it as well. And so if you can, again, have those conversations in advance, if people have already declared themselves as someone who will stand up for you, then you need to leverage that. So you're not alone, is what I'm trying to get at. Make sure that you have other people who can support you. You can go to your coach, and that's, again, a conversation that you can have in advance. What will your coach do when you show up? If there is a conflict on the team, for example, or something that happens on the field with another player, what will the coach do? You need to be having those conversations.
Thanks for that. Okay, and there was a hand somewhere, oh, right here. You can pass the mic, right? Yeah, thank you. And then I'm going to come
Thank
back.
you.
Yeah.
I have a comment and a question. One is, the sports in North America, baseball, football, were predominantly white at the turn of the 20th century and went through a process that today is more representative of North America. What did they do in that 100 years that hockey hasn't, or could it learn from that? The second point I want to make is hockey is no longer Canadian, which has not happened to the other sports. The NHL teams predominantly look around the world for players, which means when Canada used to represent more than 75% of the players in the entire NHL, and there's only 700 players in the league. But if you're searching the world for the world's best, it's more and more difficult for anyone in any country to make the top 1 percentile of that. So therefore, if it's an issue even for what we call white privilege, it's even more challenging today as it results for anybody that doesn't fit that particular class. So it's a challenge that obviously the sport has, because the sport is an international sport, contrary to football, baseball, and basketball in North America.
Just to talk about the first part of that question, I think you realize, like in history, like the importance of someone like Herb Carnegie. So Herb Carnegie, which was crazy that a lot of people who knew hockey didn't really know his story, but Herb Carnegie, around that time that the Rangers, that he gets to try for the Rangers, that's right around Jackie Robinson is breaking the color barrier, and he's also a center. He's extremely successful, so he would have been a star. And in the doc, even talking to Willie O'Ree, he said Herb Carnegie should have been the first black player in the NHL. So you can see the kind of sliding doors part of history, right? Because he doesn't play for them, and then Willie O'Ree comes later, but Willie O'Ree is really more of a fringe player, right? He's not a star. And so when he leaves the league, then there's another 14 years that there's no black player in the NHL. So just those small things of, this doesn't happen, it changes the history of the sport in a way. And I was happy to see that Herb Carnegie finally got in the Hockey Hall of Fame this year, after they've been, trying for years to try and get him in, his contributions recognized. But I think he's actually quite a pivotal figure for what can go wrong,
One thing that I'll just add in terms of some of those other leagues, football and basketball in particular, they are not representative of the racial demographics of our nations, whether you're thinking Canada or the United States. And so the predominance of black men in those sports has been researched extensively in terms of a reproduction of a plantation economy, an opportunity for white elite men to exploit black male athletes. So we don't want hockey necessarily to go there, but absolutely the gap that you point out is poignant and continues.
All right. And I'll just add that the access piece, I think other sports, accessibility, like we sort of touched on it, but playing hockey is costly. So when you look at, hockey doesn't exist on a separate island, so when you look at economics and how some communities are faring over others, it's not the most accessible sport. And then when you look at how things play out in our societies, separate from hockey, as far as racialized communities, access to education, income, getting employment opportunities, and then that's when you see, I think that's in hockey where it really plays out, because it's not basketball, you just need a pair of sneakers. You don't even, you know what I mean? So yeah, I think the access piece is a big one. Okay, thank you for that question and comment. Okay, a couple more. Mike, where are the mics? We'll go in the back there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this film. I think it's a very, very important film. It's interesting just to observe the social and economic value that the Black Hockey League represent and the community valued, and it's very sad to see that it was just disregarded and Africville just being pushed aside. It's very, very sad to see that. And particularly when we talk about the innovation of hockey as well, that was talked about, I think it's really, really sad to see that. I had a hunch that black folks had some aspect to do with the innovation of hockey, with the slap shot in particular, and I'm sure there are other pieces as well. And so it's really, your film is very, very important in that regard, and so thank you very, very much. I think it's a very, very educational piece that I'll never forget. One quick question I wanted to ask is, for the director, for Hubert, I know the film is based on the book, but I wondered, were there some consideration for First Nations Aboriginal people in regards to hockey in Canada as well? I wondered if there were some consideration there and connection to that, please. Thanks.
Yeah, I feel like we're just touching the surface. You know, we talked about that across Canada and different groups who had played hockey very early on, and there was records of it. So yeah, I think it could definitely be a series, and you could the history of hockey is actually so rich and across our country. So I kind of just stuck to one lane for this, just in order to, and there's even a generation of players, from like Mike Marson and those players as well that we didn't end up getting to include. So yeah, there's a lot left on the floor, on the cutting room floor.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, we'll take a couple more. We can take maybe one more. Okay, time. I'm getting the time signals. Yeah. Okay, so we'll go there. Okay, right here. Sorry. This right here, the young, right here. Yeah, you. Yeah. Can we take 1.5 more questions? There's a burning.
As a retired high-performance athlete, thank you for making this film. The first time I watched this, it was quite emotional and difficult to watch. And as an actor, as a film scholar and athlete, I was wondering about process. And I was wondering about the processes of care that you might have put in place or wish you'd put in place for yourself as a former athlete, as an artist, as a Black director, for yourself, your crew, and for the interviewees.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to some other documentary filmmakers a couple weeks ago, and they were saying that they actually had on set someone that people could talk to, a counselor who was just if they were going through something. I hadn't heard of that before, and I thought that made a lot of sense, when people are kind of reliving things. I had a lot of conversations just with crew, especially when we're out in Halifax, because it was a smaller crew, and we really would kind of debrief after our interviews and the things that we learned, and we'd kind of talk about all those things that it was kind of bringing up and stirring up. And I think so that's always really important, but I think the most important thing is for the interview is I want to create a space that is safe for people to talk and just really listen. I think that as a documentary filmmaker, that's kind of the best tool you have, because I think if they're sitting down on that chair, there is something that they want to say, and even people that we didn't include in that, I think it was to give them a chance to be seen and heard, and how important that is. So that really just comes down to from you, I think, as the filmmaker, is if you're there to listen and be calm and try and give them the space, then I think other people kind of pick up on that, and you try and lead from your place of privilege and advantage.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a great question, because the documentary it involves the subjects talking about a lot of sensitive personal issues and experience. So you do have to ensure that those stories are handled with care, and that your crew is taking care of yourself and your crew. That's a fantastic question. Okay, so we're gonna invite up Jada Roach for some closing remarks. Thank you for this evening. It's a
Thank you for
storm,
coming out in the snowstorm.
The crazy
Thank
weather.
you so much.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Hi everyone, I'll keep this pretty brief because I know it's getting late. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for coming out and viewing this film tonight. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you so much to Hubert and Dalton for coming to U of T tonight and sharing this with us, and to our own professors, Janelle and Simon, for engaging in this fantastic discussion. Want to say thank you to KPE, Innis College, and the Cinema Studies Institute for putting on this event for us during Black History Month. The BIPOC Varsity Association, who I'm here with tonight, was so honored and excited to be a part of this event and get to attend and watch this film. We are an organization that works to advance equity and diversity and inclusion for our student-athlete community here at U of T and beyond. We do this through mentorship, through education, through resources. Something that really touched me in the film tonight was the descriptions of feeling isolated, being the only Black player on the team or the only Black person in the room. And the BVA really hopes that no student athlete here at U of T has to feel like that, because we can be a space where they feel supported and they feel that their stories are going to be heard. So thank you very much for having us a part of this event, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. Thank you.